Before we dive into today's story, if you're passionate about Viking tales and historical narratives that touch the heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to support our channel. And don't forget to comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with our global Viking enthusiasts. Now, let's journey back to 9th century Scandinavia. The morning mist clung to the Norwegian fjords like the breath of ancient spirits. But there was nothing mystical about the terror that would soon descend upon the coastal village of Havneby. The year was 847 AD, and the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold as it rose over the rugged mountains that embraced the small settlement like protective arms. Astrid knelt by the shoreline, her calloused hands working methodically through the fishing nets her father had left to dry. At 17 winters old, she had already seen more hardship than many would face in a lifetime. Her auburn hair, braided with small shells and leather cords, caught the early light as she examined each knot with the careful attention that meant the difference between a good catch and an empty belly. The village behind her was beginning to stir. Smoke rose from the longhouses as mothers rekindled their hearth fires, and the sound of axes splitting wood echoed across the water. Children's laughter mixed with the bleating of goats and the soft lowing of cattle. It was a sound that had greeted every dawn for generations, the sound of life continuing, of people who had carved out existence from the harsh beauty of the northern lands. Astrid's younger brother, Olaf, came running toward the shore, his bare feet splashing through the shallow water. At 12 years old, he possessed the endless energy that seemed reserved for youth, but his face carried the premature seriousness that came from losing parents too young. Their mother had died in childbirth 3 winters past, and their father had been claimed by the sea during a storm the following spring. "Astrid!" Olaf called out, his voice carrying both excitement and concern. "Elder Ragnar wants all the able-bodied to gather at the Long Hall. There are ships on the horizon." She looked up from the nets, her grey eyes scanning the waters beyond the fjord's mouth. Indeed, there were dark shapes moving against the morning light, too many and too large to be merchant vessels or friendly neighbours. Her stomach tightened with a fear she had learned to recognize, the same feeling that had preceded every tragedy that had befallen their family. "How many?" she asked, continuing her work with forced calm. Panic would serve no purpose now. "Ragnar counted at least 8 longships," Olaf replied, settling beside her on the rocky shore, maybe more hidden by the mist. Astrid's hands stilled on the nets. 8 longships meant raiders, and not just any raiders, but a force large enough to overwhelm their small village completely. Havneby's 37 souls had survived this long by being unremarkable, by having little wealth to attract attention, and by the blessing of geography that kept them hidden from the main sea routes. But their luck, it seemed, had finally run out. The siblings made their way up the winding path that led from the shore to the village proper. The settlement was built on a natural terrace carved into the hillside, with the long hall at its centre, and the smaller houses arranged in a rough semicircle around it. The buildings were constructed of thick timber and stone, built to withstand the fierce northern winters, but they would offer little protection against determined raiders. Inside the long hall, the entire village had gathered. Elder Ragnar, his grey beard reaching nearly to his belt, stood before the central fire pit. His weathered face bore the gravity of a man who had seen enough of life to understand when hope was slim. Around him, the villagers sat on rough wooden benches, their faces reflecting various degrees of fear, resignation, and desperate determination. "The ships fly no banners we recognize," Ragnar announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "They are low in the water, heavily laden with warriors. By my count, they carry at least 200 men." A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly. 200 warriors against their village's handful of men, most of whom were farmers and fishermen with little experience in warfare. Astrid's adoptive guardian, Ingrid, reached for her hand. Ingrid was a woman of perhaps 40 winters, her own children long grown and settled in distant lands. She had taken in the orphaned siblings, not out of obligation, but from genuine affection, and the understanding that survival often depended on the bonds formed within a community. "What choices do we have?" asked Thorstein, the village's best hunter and their closest approximation to a warrior. His hand rested on the axe at his belt, a tool more often used for splitting wood than splitting skulls, but deadly enough in capable hands. Ragnar's eyes swept across the gathering before settling on the central fire. "We can flee to the high caves in the mountains, take what we can carry, and abandon everything else. The raiders will burn what they cannot take, but we would live, and starve in the mountains when winter comes," added Ingrid quietly. "Without our stores, without our livestock, without shelter, the other choice," Ragnar continued, "is to make our stand here. Fight for what is ours, die as free people rather than live as beggars in the wilderness." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. Astrid felt the familiar burden that had settled on her shoulders since becoming responsible for Olaf. Every choice she made now would determine not just her own fate, but that of the boy who had become her world. Young Eric, barely 14 but already showing the promise of becoming a fine warrior like his father before him, spoke up from the back of the hall. "What if we tried to negotiate, offer them what little we have in exchange for leaving us in peace?" "Raiders like these don't negotiate," replied Thorstein grimly. "They take what they want and burn the rest. It's their way." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horns echoed across the water, deep, resonating notes that spoke of approaching doom. Through the open doorway of the long hall, they could see the longships growing larger on the horizon, their dragonheads cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of destruction. Astrid stood slowly, feeling all eyes turned toward her. Though she was neither the eldest nor the strongest, something in her bearing commanded attention, perhaps the quiet strength that had kept her and Olaf alive through their hardships. "Elder Ragnar," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "if we flee to the caves, how long could we survive there before we're forced to return?" The old man considered the question carefully. "Perhaps until the first snows, no longer." "And if we fight? Some of us might die gloriously, the rest would die anyway." Astrid nodded, processing this information with the practical mindset that had served her well. "Then perhaps there is a third path. We cannot fight them directly, but we might be able to bargain for time. Raiders need supplies, fresh water, provisions for their next target. If we can convince them we're more valuable alive than dead." "You would have us become thralls?" The question came from Thorstein, his voice sharp with wounded pride. "I would have us survive," Astrid replied simply, "and surviving sometimes requires swallowing our pride. We are not warriors, we are farmers and fishermen and crafters, but we know these waters, these lands. We know where to find fresh game and clean water. We know which routes are safe and which are treacherous. That knowledge has value to raiders planning their next strikes." Elder Ragnar stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It is possible. Some raiding parties do spare settlements that prove useful to them, but it would mean living under their rule, at their mercy. Better to live under their mercy than to die under their axes," Ingrid said quietly, her hand still clasping Astrid's. The debate continued, but the sound of approaching oars was growing louder. Soon they would need to make their choice, and live or die with the consequences. Astrid looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people who had shared their joys and sorrows, who had helped raise her and Olaf, who represented the only family either of them had known since their parents' deaths. Whatever happened next, she was determined to find a way to protect them all. The longships beached on the rocky shore with the grinding sound of wood against stone, their dragon prows casting long shadows across the sand. From her position near the village's main path, Astrid could see the raiders disembarking with the practiced efficiency of seasoned warriors. They wore mail shirts that caught the morning light, carried round shields painted with fierce designs, and moved with the confident swagger of men who had tasted victory in countless battles. The village had made its decision in those final moments of debate. They would attempt to negotiate, to prove their value as a living settlement rather than a burned ruin. It was a desperate gambit, but as Astrid had argued, desperation sometimes bred the most creative solutions. Elder Ragnar stood at the forefront of their small delegation, flanked by Thorstein and 3 other village men. Astrid had insisted on being part of the group, despite protests about her age and gender. Her knowledge of the coastal waters and her quick thinking had already proven valuable. They would need every advantage they could muster in the coming confrontation. The raider chieftain was impossible to miss as he strode up the beach. He stood nearly a head taller than his men, his long red hair and beard braided with silver rings and small bones. His cloak was dyed the deep crimson that gave away both his wealth and his fearsome reputation. Only successful raiders could afford such luxury. Most intimidating of all were his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, that seemed to assess everything with the calculating gaze of a predator. Behind him came his warband, perhaps 50 of his finest warriors, while the rest remained with the ships. These men bore the scars and confident bearing of veterans who had survived countless raids. Their weapons were well maintained, their armor fitted properly. This was no desperate band of outcasts, but a professional force led by a chieftain at the height of his power. "I am Ragnar the Grey, Elder of Havnaby," the old man announced as the raiders approached, his voice carrying across the morning air. "We would speak with your leader under the laws of parley." The crimson chieftain's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it held no warmth. "I am Hakon Bloodaxe," he replied, his voice like gravel grinding against stone, "and I decide what laws apply in the lands I visit." Despite his words, he raised his hand to halt his men's advance, indicating he was at least willing to listen. This small gesture gave Astrid a spark of hope. Pragmatic leaders could sometimes be reasoned with, even when honorable ones could not. "We are a small village," Ragnar continued, spreading his hands to show he carried no weapons. "We have little gold, few treasures, but we offer something that might be more valuable to a chieftain of your reputation." Hakon's pale eyes narrowed slightly. "And what might that be, old man?" "Knowledge. These waters hold secrets that could make your next raids far more profitable. We know where the wealthy merchant ships shelter during storms, which settlements have the best defenses and which are vulnerable. We know the tides, the currents, the seasonal patterns that could mean the difference between a successful raid and ships dashed against the rocks." The chieftain studied the delegation for a long moment, his gaze moving from face to face before settling on Astrid. She felt exposed under that cold scrutiny, as if he could see through to her very soul. When he spoke, his words were directed to her rather than to Ragnar. "And you, girl, what do you offer?" Astrid lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, despite the fear that made her knees want to buckle. "I know these waters better than any living soul, Lord Chieftain. My father was a fisherman who taught me every current, every hidden rock, every safe harbor from here to the Orkney Islands. I can guide your ships safely through passages that would wreck lesser navigators." "Can you now?" Hakon stepped closer and Astrid caught the scent of salt and iron and something darker, the smell that clung to men who had seen too much death. "And why should I trust the word of a village girl who has probably never been beyond sight of her own shore?" Before Astrid could respond, young Olaf spoke up from his position beside the delegation. His voice cracked with emotion as he called out, "Please, Lord, please don't burn our village. We've already lost so much. Our parents, our neighbors who tried to flee last winter. This is all we have left." The plea hung in the air like a physical thing, raw and desperate. Some of the raiders shifted uncomfortably at the boy's words, perhaps remembering their own losses or younger siblings left behind. But Hakon's expression remained unmoved. "Your brother speaks truly," he said to Astrid, his tone conversational. "I have already decided to burn your village. The question is whether I do so with you still inside your homes or after you have proven your worth to me." He gestured to one of his men, who brought forth a torch already soaked in pitch. The morning breeze carried the sharp scent of the fuel, a smell that spoke of destruction and endings. "I am not an unreasonable man," Hakon continued, accepting the torch but not yet lighting it. "Prove to me that your knowledge is worth more than the example I would make of your village, and perhaps we can reach an accommodation." Failed to convince me. He let the threat hang unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Astrid's mind raced, searching for something that would capture his attention, some piece of information that would make him see their value. "The merchant Prince Aldrich of Northumberland," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "His treasure fleet will pass through the twisted straits in 3 days' time, carrying the profits from his summer trading in the eastern lands, but only someone who knows the secret channels can intercept them there. The main passage is too well guarded by his warships." Hakon's hand stilled on the torch. "Go on." "The straits are treacherous, ship-killing waters that most navigators avoid entirely, but there is a path through, known only to the local fishermen. My father discovered it during a storm, when he was forced to seek shelter. The treasure ships use it as a shortcut when they're behind schedule, trusting in their hired local pilot to see them safely through." She took a deep breath, committing fully to the gamble. "I know that pilot. I know his route, his timing, and more importantly, I know where he is most vulnerable to attack. A single longship, properly positioned, could take the entire fleet." The chieftain's pale eyes glittered with interest now. "And what would prevent me from simply torturing this information out of you before burning your village anyway? Because the waters change with each tide, each season," Astrid replied, her voice gaining strength. "What I offer is not just knowledge, but skill. The ability to read the signs that tell when the passage is safe, when it's deadly, and when it's perfect for an ambush. Kill me, and you lose not just the information, but the experience to use it safely." Hakon studied her for what felt like an eternity. Around them, the morning had grown still. Even the seabirds seemed to sense the weight of the moment. The fate of Havnaby hung in the balance, dependent on the calculations of a man whose reputation was built on violence and whose mercy was rarer than gold. Finally, he smiled, and this time there was genuine amusement in the expression. "You have courage, girl, and cunning. These are qualities I can respect." He gestured to his men. "Very well, you have 3 days to prove your worth. If this treasure fleet appears as you claim, and if your guidance leads us to a successful capture, then Havnaby will be spared." "And if the fleet doesn't come?" Elder Ragnar asked quietly. Hakon's smile faded. "Then I will light this torch myself, and your village will burn as a lesson to others about the price of lying to Hakon Bloodaxe." He tossed the unlit torch to one of his men and turned back toward the ships. "We will make camp on your beach. See that we are well fed and provisioned. And girl," he added, looking back at Astrid, "you will remain close at hand. If you attempt to flee, everyone in this village dies." As the raiders began setting up their camp, Astrid felt the weight of her gamble settling on her shoulders. She had bought them time, but at a terrible cost. In 3 days, she would either prove herself the savior of Havnaby or the architect of its destruction. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered the question she dared not voice aloud. What if she had been wrong about the treasure fleet's schedule? 2 days had passed since Hakon Bloodaxe and his warband had made their camp on the shores of Havnaby. The village had taken on a strange, tense atmosphere, part occupied territory, part uneasy coexistence. The raiders had proven surprisingly disciplined, taking only what they needed for sustenance and treating the villagers with a rough but not actively cruel indifference. It was clear that Hakon ran a tight ship, and his men knew better than to jeopardize their chieftain's plans with unnecessary violence. Astrid had spent both days in careful preparation, studying the waters and weather signs with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Everything depended on her ability to read the natural world correctly, the wind patterns, the tide schedules, the subtle signs that would tell her whether Aldrich's treasure fleet would indeed attempt the passage through the twisted straits. The morning of the 3rd day dawned grey and overcast, with a steady wind from the southeast that set whitecaps dancing across the fjord. Astrid stood on the rocky promontory that overlooked the straits, her trained eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching sails. Beside her, Hakon waited with the patience of a seasoned predator, his crimson cloak whipping in the morning breeze. "Your merchant prince is late," he observed, his tone conversational but carrying an undertone of threat. "The wind is against them," Astrid replied, pointing to the cloud formations on the horizon. "They will have had to tack repeatedly to make headway, but see how the clouds are building to the north. There will be a storm tonight, which means they will be eager to reach safe harbor. If they come at all, it will be within the next few hours." Behind them, Hakon's warriors prepared their longship for launch. The Crimson Chieftain had chosen his 30 best men for this venture, leaving the rest to guard the camp and ensure the villagers' continued cooperation. The longship itself was a thing of beauty and menace, sleek-hulled and swift, with a dragon prow that seemed to snarl with anticipation. Olaf approached from the village, carrying a leather satchel of provisions that Ingrid had prepared. The boy had grown quieter over the past 2 days, the weight of their situation settling heavily on his young shoulders. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his sister was gambling with all their lives. "Astrid," he said quietly, "what if—" "No," she cut him off gently but firmly. "We don't speak of what-ifs now. We focus on what must be done." Hakon watched this exchange with interest. "The boy worries for you," he observed, "as he should. What you attempt today is dangerous even for experienced sea raiders." "Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Astrid replied, echoing words their father had often spoken. "The question is whether the danger is worth the prize." "Spoken like a true raider," Hakon said with what might have been approval. "Perhaps there is more Viking blood in you than your peaceful village would suggest." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Astrid found herself checking and rechecking the wind direction, the tide markers, all the natural signs that would indicate the optimal time for the ambush she had planned. The twisted straits earned their name from the serpentine course they carved between towering cliffs and hidden reefs. At high tide, with favorable winds, they offered a swift passage for those bold or desperate enough to attempt it. At any other time, they were a ship's graveyard. It was just past midday when Olaf spotted them first, 3 dark shapes on the horizon, their sails full with the wind that had finally shifted in their favor. Astrid's heart hammered in her chest as she raised the spyglass Hakon had provided, focusing on the distant vessels. 3 ships, she confirmed, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. 2 war galleys escorting a larger merchant vessel. The treasure ship will be the one in the middle. See how deep she sits in the water. Hakon took the spyglass and studied the approaching fleet for a long moment. "They fly Aldrich's banner," he acknowledged. "You were right about that much. But can they be taken?" "Follow me," Astrid said, leading him down a treacherous path that wound between the cliff faces toward a hidden inlet. "This is where we must position ourselves. The current creates a back eddy here that will slow their progress, and the cliffs will hide us until the last moment." The inlet was barely large enough for the longship, carved into the rock by centuries of wave action. More importantly, it provided a perfect vantage point for the narrow channel that ships had to navigate through the most dangerous part of the straits. "The war galleys will go first," Astrid explained as they watched the fleet approach. "They'll be watching for threats from ahead, not from the sides. The merchant vessel will follow in their wake, trusting in their protection. But just here," she pointed to a section of the channel where the rocks created a natural bottleneck. "They'll have to slow down and proceed in single file." Hakon nodded slowly, his tactical mind processing the possibilities. "And if we strike at that moment, the war galleys will be past us and unable to turn quickly in the narrow water. The merchant ship will be trapped between the rocks and our ship, but timing will be everything. Strike too early, and they can retreat. Too late, and they'll be through the bottleneck and in open water where their numbers give them the advantage." The chieftain's pale eyes gleamed with anticipation. "You have planned this well, girl. Perhaps you do have the soul of a raider after all." As the afternoon wore on, the treasure fleet drew steadily closer. Astrid could now make out individual figures on the decks, could see the glint of weapons and armor as the escort crews prepared for the treacherous passage ahead. The lead war galley bore the scars of previous encounters, patched planking and new-looking rigging that spoke of recent repairs. "They've seen fighting recently," Håkon observed, following her gaze. "Good. Battle-weary crews are more likely to make mistakes." The long ship lay hidden in the inlet, her crew ready at the oars. Astrid had positioned herself at the prow, where she could watch the approaching ships and signal the optimal moment to strike. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the rope that would release their concealing sailcloth. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the next few minutes. The first war galley entered the straits with careful precision, her experienced navigator reading the waters with the same skill Astrid had used to plan their ambush. The rhythm of her oars changed as she encountered the tricky currents, slowing her progress exactly as Astrid had predicted. The merchant vessel followed, riding deep in the water with her cargo of eastern silks, precious metals, and exotic goods. Even from a distance, Astrid could see the tension in her crew as they negotiated the dangerous passage. These were not warriors but traders, more concerned with preserving their valuable cargo than with fighting off raiders. "Now," Håkon whispered, his hand resting on his axe. "Not yet," Astrid replied, her eyes fixed on the lead galley. "Wait, wait." Jason, the first escort ship, reached the bottleneck and began the delicate maneuver required to navigate between the jutting rocks. Her attention was focused entirely ahead, her crew straining at the oars to maintain proper position against the current. "Now!" Astrid shouted, pulling the rope that released their concealment. The longship burst from the inlet like a hunting wolf, her dragon prow cutting through the water as 30 pairs of oars bit deep. The surprise was complete. The merchant vessel's crew barely had time to shout warnings before the raiders were among them, grappling hooks flying and warriors leaping across the gap between ships. The battle was swift and brutal. The merchant crew, caught off guard and outnumbered, surrendered after only a few minutes of fighting. The escort galleys, trapped by the narrow confines of the straits, could only watch helplessly as their charge was captured before their eyes. Håkon Bloodaxe stood on the deck of the captured treasure ship, his crimson cloak now splattered with blood, surveying the chests of gold and precious goods that validated Astrid's promises. His pale eyes found hers across the chaos of the aftermath, and for a moment she saw something that might have been respect in their icy depths. "Well done, Sea Witch," he called out. "Your village has earned its reprieve." But as Astrid watched the defeated escort galleys retreating toward open water, carrying news of this successful raid back to Aldrich's court, she wondered what price Havnaby would ultimately pay for their survival. They had saved their homes from burning, but they had also marked themselves as collaborators with raiders, as people who could not be trusted by other settlements along the coast. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of the approaching storm, and Astrid pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. They had survived this day, but she suspected their trials were far from over. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the harbour of Havnaby as Astrid stood once again on the familiar shoreline, mending nets with the same methodical precision that had occupied her hands on that fateful morning when Håkon Bloodaxe first appeared on their horizon. But much had changed in the village since that day. Some things for the better, others carrying the bitter taste of compromise and moral complexity. True to his word, Håkon had spared the village from destruction. More than that, he had established Havnaby as a way station for his raiding fleet, bringing a strange form of prosperity to the once struggling settlement. The raiders paid fair prices for provisions, fresh water, and repairs to their ships. The village's fishermen found new markets for their catch among the crews of visiting longships. Children who had known only hunger now had full bellies and warm clothes. But prosperity had come at a price that weighed heavily on Astrid's conscience. The successful ambush of Aldrich's treasure fleet had been only the beginning. Over the following months, Astrid had found herself drawn deeper into Hakon's world, her knowledge of coastal waters making her invaluable to his increasingly ambitious raids. She had guided his ships to 3 more successful attacks, each one bringing wealth to both the raiders and, by extension, to her village. Yet each success had also brought consequences. Word had spread along the coast of a settlement that aided raiders, a village that could not be trusted. Trade with neighboring communities had dried up. Families who had once intermarried between settlements now viewed Havnaby with suspicion and fear. The village had become prosperous but isolated, wealthy outcasts in a region where cooperation had once been the key to survival. Olaf, now 13 and showing the first signs of the man he would become, approached along the shore. The boy had grown taller over the past months, but more importantly, he had grown wiser. The innocence in his eyes had been replaced by an understanding of the world's complexities that no child should have to bear. "The raiding season is ending," he said, settling beside his sister on the rocks. "Hakon's ships won't return until spring." Astrid nodded, her fingers working automatically through the mesh of the fishing net. "And what will we do during the winter months, when there are no raiders to trade with, no ships to provision?" It was a question that had been weighing on the entire village. Their newfound prosperity was entirely dependent on their relationship with Hakon and his warband. Without that connection, they would be left with their isolation, their reputation as collaborators, and dwindling options for survival. "Elder Ragnar thinks some of the young men should join Hakon's crew," Olaf said quietly, "become raiders themselves. That way, we would always have a connection to the warband, and they would send part of their spoils back to support the village." The suggestion made Astrid's stomach tighten with unease. It was a logical next step, perhaps inevitable given the path they had chosen. But it also represented a complete transformation of what their community had once been. Peaceful fishermen and farmers turned into professional raiders. "And what do you think?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Olaf was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the waters where so many fateful decisions had been made. "I think that sometimes there are no good choices," he said finally. "Only choices we can live with, and choices we cannot." The wisdom in his words struck Astrid like a physical blow. Her little brother, who had once cried out in desperate innocence for their village to be spared, now understood the moral ambiguity that had governed their survival. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Astrid reflected on the events that had led them to this moment. She had set out to save her village, and in that narrow sense, she had succeeded. Havnaby still stood, its people still lived, and they were more prosperous than they had ever been. But she had also transformed them into something unrecognizable from what they had once been. The question that haunted her now was whether that transformation represented salvation or a different kind of destruction, one that happened slowly, from within, as people gradually became something they had never intended to be. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her brooding. Elder Ragnar made his way carefully down the rocky path, his aged frame moving with the deliberate caution of a man who had seen too many winters. "The council has made its decision," he announced without preamble. "We will send 6 young men to join Hakon's crew when he returns in the spring. Eric, Thorstein's boy Magnus, and 4 others have volunteered." Astrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "And if they die in some foreign land, if they are captured or lost at sea, then we will mourn them, as we have mourned all our losses," Ragnar replied simply. "But we will survive. That has become our greatest skill, Astrid. Not fishing, not farming, not any of the peaceful arts we once practiced. We have become experts at survival, whatever the cost." As the old man made his way back up the path, Astrid was left alone with her thoughts and the weight of the choices she had made. In the distance, she could see the smoke rising from the village hearths, warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. Children played in the streets between the houses, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Life continued, as it always had, but transformed by the decisions made in moments of desperation. Perhaps Olaf was right. Perhaps there were no truly good choices, only those they could live with. Astrid had chosen survival over honor, prosperity over peace, pragmatism over principle. History would judge whether those had been the right decisions, but for now, her village endured. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she gathered up her mended nets and turned toward home, carrying with her the knowledge that every dawn brought new choices, and that the price of survival was never paid just once, but again and again, with each decision that shaped who they would become. The age of Vikings was an age of hard choices, and Havneby had learned to make them. For better or worse, they had learned to survive. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Viking Age Norway. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from history's most fascinating periods. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Until next time, may you have the wisdom to make difficult choices and the strength to live with their consequences.